We're back again with another episode of Open Internet Pod here with Richard Paris.
Welcome,
Um,
everyone.
so, starting today, we're going to go on this mini series exploring what has happened to the internet. How did the business models evolve? What is a SaaS? Why does social media have to have an addictive feed? And why did China and Russia close off their internet, right? So, hopefully, as we go through these topics, you'll get a broader understanding and perspective of how the internet works in various parts of the world, and why Web3 is such an important paradigm shift in the transformation of the internet, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I get a feeling that we've had really positive feedback to what we're doing here, and I think people are really interested in kind of what's going on. These topics are really trenchant to people, and we've dived in because it's so, we see it's so important, and there's so much going on. There's so much chatter and talk about these topics, and we've kind of pulled back a little bit and realized, well, maybe, for some people, diving in that deep straight away, is leaving them a little bit cold. And there's actually so much nuance and information that you can get out of just sort of looking into how did we get here? What's going on? People have a sense that something's gone wrong. Not just that something's wrong. Maybe the young people just think something's wrong. But most, sort of anyone who's been around for a few years on the internet has a feeling that something's changed. Something's gone off. And so let's dig a little bit today into what is that change? What's happened? And to do that, the best place to start is where were we? Like, where did things start off and how did we get here?
Exactly. But before we get started, Richard, I think it would be nice if you could give us some background to your involvement with the internet. Word around the campfire is that you grew up connected to the ARPANET. Is that true?
Not quite. I'm not a U.S. military facility, for one thing. So no, or nor a U.S. learning institution. But probably the best indication of just how old and how internet-y I am that you could possibly have is when I was pre-high school, there was a summer program at the local library where in one of the halls they just show movies. This is the 80s where kids ran wild. We just sort of wandered around when our parents were at work on school holidays. And we could just go to the library and watch films that were like around last year. Great thing. I still remember it really fondly. And anyway, I missed most of Superman 3 because somewhere else in the library, some geeks were showing off like a thing that looked like two kind of pieces of protective equipment or something, like two boots, and had a phone jammed into it, and they were like connecting to other computers somewhere else in town, and it made these horrible screaming noises, but you could see that they could send messages, and I thought that thing was intriguing, and I stuck around like the whole 2 hours of the movie instead of like watching the movie, just talking to these guys about what this thing actually was and how it worked. And I didn't understand most of what they said because I was like 8, something like that, 7 maybe, but it stuck with me, this idea of connecting machines together so that they could do things. So I wasn't quite ARPANET. That was sort of mid late 80s, but yeah, I still have this very strong memory of like hearing kids laughing at the movie in the kind of fall behind me, but watching this thing like connect and like seeing things come up on it's one of those amber screens. That's a really strong memory for me. But I think I also kind of had a sense that things were changing. Like this was new and important, and connecting machines together. Because I'd played with like very, very early computers. I had a sense that like making them talk to each other was going to be a thing. So that's my kind of internet origin story, which is kind of cool when I think about it, because it didn't occur to me until we had this sort of prep for this chat.
Yeah, it was very interesting because I've had some sort of similar experience, but I never really went into the internet full beans, even though I, hacked websites and got into like some shady business as well back in the 90s.
It's the right way to learn the internet.
It's the right way to learn the internet, yeah. But it always I think the issue that I had was that I thought that this can't be it. I felt like surely it's much more to it. It's the same
Mm.
problem I had with Apple. When I first got my PowerBook G4, and I thought that this is so obvious, much better than anything else. There's no point in even trying to buy stock because nobody would sell it. This was in 2000, it was like $45 a share. So I think I had this idea of the internet, and things around the internet being more complicated than they actually were,
Mm.
but still a very interesting space.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something that for a lot of people was just intriguing from the moment you found out it was even possible. Right. Like,
all right, so let's get into it. Let me paint a picture for you, right? It's the 90s. In the US, you have e-commerce, stuff like Amazon, eBay, VC funded. In Europe, you have all these fragmented telecom portals, boo.com, and in Asia, you have SoftBank pushing all these networks, and you have tom.com. And then came the dot-com crash. US market gets wiped up. There are a few survivors. European market is devastated, probably never recovered from that. And Asia has this mixed crash due to the fact that, they had a previous crash in 97. And I'm wondering, was this the winner takes all moment? Was this the moment where the survivors from the US kind of got the war chest to go and take over the rest of the world?
don't think so, but I think it really set the precedent, right? So it was definitely definitive, and I think it set the model that was to come, right? Hyperscaling and various things. So I mean, it's certainly the big inflection, in the internet, and in some ways, it's just I can see the same thing coming with AI, right? And obviously, massive and disruptive technology turns up. Everyone runs in because why wouldn't you? And for the most part, that was a bad idea. Pets.com was never going to be $1 trillion company. And so you then have a thrashing out and a bit of a nasty period where you're dealing with the repercussions of everyone thinking they were going to make $1 billion a day on the internet. But it also introduced a bunch of the business models, the tech, the infrastructure, including the VC infrastructure that was important in then building out the internet we see in front of us. So, kind of a lot of actually really important companies launched into that because they were the things people were excited about, and some of them just lasted. So, like Google launched 98. If you look at their history, that crash is a blip. Right, it's a tiny little blip on what happened to them. But in terms of people's consciousness of the internet, it was the founding moment where most people at the time kind of suddenly realized there was something out there that wasn't just a nerdy tool for like sending your Excel sheet to someone or something.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, a bit of the magic that was the internet during that period has also disappeared because there was, you'd go on the internet and you'd look like what's new on the internet, what new cool websites, right?
It's certainly the time that time period was where you started to get the tooling coming together. So people realized, oh, it's big. Okay, we need some kind of index, some way of finding stuff. And for people who grew up with Google, it just seems obvious that you'd have a search engine. But there were things before search engines that were alternative methods. So people tried to build massive indexes, right? Where everyone could post their thing into this big index and hopefully you could find what you're looking for that way. It quickly became clear that that wasn't really a thing. But the first search engines were actually based on that logic, right? So the first search engines were like, you put categories on your website and then we'll help people category search for websites by like making a list of all the categories people said so they can find you. Of course, that falls apart 25 seconds later because some people are miscategorizing accidentally and some are doing it quite on purpose because they want the traffic or whatever. And so you had this sort of nascent ad business at the same time, but it was also, prehistoric compared to kind of modern day ad tech. And so you have this, kind of coming together of like discovering how that stuff can even work. And I think the big thing there for kind of the arc we want to talk about, in this sort of miniseries is what we saw happening there was people kind of feeling out the business models, and it wasn't, it's one of those sort of founder bias things where people stand on a lectern and tell you just how to build Facebook. Actually, there were 500 people building stuff that never went anywhere. And in some ways, it's like try every business model and see which one works, right? It's still smart for the people who built the right one, but a lot of the stuff that we see came out of all of that, just experimentation and craziness.
Just want to make like a quick aside here because despite the fact that a lot of people were building a lot of things, MySpace was a thing, High Five was a thing at some point. You can put your tinfoil hat on when I say this, but
Yeah.
I think it's not by accident that the same day that DARPA closed LifeLog is the exact same day when Facebook gets incorporated. The exact
I
same
did not
day.
know that.
Yeah, and it's a very similar. If you read about LifeLog and what it was
Right.
meant to do, Facebook, it's literally the civilian version of it. So I think there's also this aspect of, maybe just like the internet was part of DARPANET, maybe there's technology and winners are being picked in advance and like dropped in here and there. So we shouldn't feel so bad.
Well, no, I mean, I think the big thing, that came out of that was that exploration. Lots of people trying lots of business models, and I think a lot of it's also, I mean, it's not just organic, right? There's a desire to have things. There's a question of what the VC's funding and why. There's a question of in regulatory terms, like a whole lot of things happen purely because of quirks of regulation, whether, particularly in the US, whether you could do money transfers across a state or whatever, that kind of thing that really shaped the way the internet kind of formed, because the rules, and that's another thing that's, maybe not clear to people, is that the regulations and the rules that existed in the 90s and early 2000s, there were no internet rules, right? So people were using the regulations for telephones and the regulations for radio and print to try and work out, like, how should we regulate these things, because no one had seen it. The internet didn't have a big enough presence in people's minds that you could have an internet law of any kind.
Right.
I mean, that's completely changed now, and states feel entirely justified in having internet policy and internet regulation and so on and so forth.
Yes, especially if you're the EU, you love the regulation. It's
If it's not a bottle cap, it's actually no, they regulated those too.
I think that's gonna be like the crown achievement of the EU. It's gonna be that bottle cap.
It's not a terrible idea, but whether that should be what your society is based on is another question.
It's very interesting how these I guess you could call it innovation, but it's hardly an innovation. But you could see it in the context of everything else, how it kind of becomes something else. It becomes a symbol of the failure of innovation, right?
I believe that the current standard on aluminium cans, where you puncture it with a lever, was Australian, because Australians are incredibly proud of that. And that got rid of all the wrinkles. So there you go. In another world, you can be super proud of things like that. Oh, okay. Your internet seemed to glitch there for a second.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what happened. It's
no worries.
Yeah, I'm back. So you're talking about the glitch, the puncturing of the.
Right, Australians will be proud of anything that they think went international from Australia. You'll never find them happier than pointing out to Americans that AC/DC are in fact Australian when they were actually born in Scotland. Don't tell anyone.
Oh, really?
Dutch and Scots, yeah.
I'm losing my connection here. Let's see if this works.
Bear with us, people, if this is choppy at the moment.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. Let's see. Now I think should be back. But yeah, so you have all these all these things happening like early on the internet, and people are testing things out, right?
Yeah.
But eventually you get to this inflection point where they're starting to coalesce into really big really big companies, right? Before I don't they couldn't get this open internet act. They were trying to throttle usage of bandwidth depending on what you were doing, right? So
Hmm.
the big companies wanted to have more bandwidth, and I think the Obama administration didn't really allow for that. So they did something else, right? They just like, okay,
Hmm.
let's just get everybody hooked on the content. Let's make sure that we have so much stuff that there's no point in going anywhere else, right?
Hmm.
So, you get to the internet today and it feels like it's made out of 4 or 5 websites, depending on what you like to do.
Hmm.
Um, but not only that, these websites also transitioned into apps and
Yeah.
use that as a way to mine more and more data from the users. It's like the mobile phone with all its sensors was built to go hand in hand with this data harvesting push. You know,
Yeah. It's
close the user inside an app so that the company can control everything around it.
yeah. Well, I think this is a great case to like look at how we like. This is really the how we got here on steroids, right? So it's I've used the kind of music industry analogy before in the pod where we've talked about like a technology doing something genuinely novel and amazing for people and they just can't get enough of it. So recording onto physical media just changed people's lives, right? The idea that you didn't have to stand around a piano and sing your favorite songs printed on paper or listen to someone doing that. You could hear really good artists at their best. um Wonderful thing. The internet was similar. It gave you this connectivity, etc. The thing is that people assume that like the tech just landed, right? Or maybe things are faster, we've got better chips or something. But there was an accretion of capabilities on the internet, and also its regulation and the way it controls itself has changed completely over time. So we talked about ARPANET before, right? Originally, the way I kind of think of it is like, things moving around the internet, like messaging, was like hobos on the old dusty highways of 30s America, where if you found an email like limping along, you would help it on its way because the network was like servers were down all the time, connectivity was almost nothing, and so the result was when we got to having like corporate email, it's completely misdesigned for the purpose, right? It's designed to get any malformed email wherever it's going. So spammers don't even have to put in the effort to properly address and to properly finish off email. They don't have to stamp it. They don't have to do anything because the system was built for get that precious little email where it's going, do whatever you can to do that, right? And we see that across the board. So nothing was secure at the start because it was just like everyone was just like, hooray, I'm communicating. And it was kind of mostly academic communications. So, or it was coded because it was the military and they were thinking old school radio, right? You encode what you say across open paths. So it didn't come with any kind of encryption. Nobody had computers. If you had a computer, it meant you were a sizable institution. So there's no identity, right? You just got to declare who you were. I am Berkeley, right? Because there was only you and 5 other institutions on the network, so no one was going to lie, right? And so there were kind of these missing pieces that it wasn't bad design or whatever, but even the web was like late 80s. That wasn't so formed really in the early 90s. It actually became available to people. That wasn't originally on the internet. It's not always been the web. The connectivity was there before we even had the ability to post a page. Right? It did fundamental little things underneath that. And so what you had this mess of technologies. And we just talked about it. We had the boom around 2000. So people started to see there's money in it and stuff. Crash. So now you've got only the serious players left. And they're looking at this, and they're also VC backed. So now they're starting to say, well, we need to turn this into a business. So we need to grow. We need a lot of customers, because one thing we've worked out is people don't pay a lot around here, right? There's not a lot of money per user. So we're going to have to be clever about how do we build something that a hell of a lot of people use, and where we're really clever about monetizing whatever they do, because it ain't going to be a lot of money for us. So we're going to have to take a sliver on advertising or whatever. What you ended up having out of that was people worked out the things that the network was missing: identity management, security, payments, those kinds of things. And they built systems on top of this network that let you do that. And that was a genuine benefit, right? Like, Amazon's still convenient, despite the fact that most of us kick ourselves every time we use it for like feeding the dragon. But it's hard to imagine when online payments were still difficult, and there was also no crypto. So you really had a struggle. There's someone there telling you on the internet, I have a thing you want, a reprint of a rare book or dope, or whatever it was back in the day. How do you pay for it, right? Like, it was really, that was just not a thing you could do. And, people had ads about how dangerous it was to give your credit card number to people on the internet because it wasn't encrypted. And so, until Let's Encrypt came along 2016, 15, 16, it was basically really expensive, stupidly expensive. It was an extortion racket to even secure a website, to get SSL on it, which had only been around for a short time, to then, get a certificate, super expensive and blah, blah, blah. So what you had was companies coming in and say, we'll fill that gap. But we obviously have to run a lot of servers. We have to provide one hell of a service. So the way to do that was to get VC funding to make it good. But a little bit of VC funding wasn't enough, because you needed a hell of a lot of users to pay the VC back. And that got easier and easier, funnily enough, the more and more money you took. So if you had $1 million, it was hard to build something that would get you $1 million back to pay the VC back. If you asked for $500 million, it was actually easier, because these things are exponentially scaling. So that gave you not all of it went, that meant the tech spend was much smaller part, and you needed to build a much bigger data center, and you needed to do more advertising. And the thing is, that's where you got your moat. So what we had was a system where, once Google came out with a better search engine, they suddenly got so much funding and so much momentum and such a good product that it became almost impossible to chase them down, to beat them. And once, you had a whole sea of different social networks, but then Facebook really cornered that. And then you had a whole bunch of different ways of messaging, but you kind of ended up with private messaging and then Twitter. That was like, for a long time, that was it in the West. Those were your things, right? And those companies initially did something that people just loved. Every techie was like, oh, are you on Twitter yet? And no, I'm not. Oh, you go and look at it. It's great. You had this kind of super excitement about it. Gmail was hard to get, and you had to get an invite, right? As weird as that seems now. And so
affect your scarcity.
Right, exactly. And they invented a lot of those things that we just take as perfectly normal. So what you have, and I am getting to your point about apps, what you have is you've built this ecosystem where funneling in huge volumes of people and locking them into things, because you provided them with identity management, you provided them with data storage, you provided them with connectivity. Those are things that the network didn't naturally come with, so you've given them that security. Now you're looking at it saying, well, I've got that. I've got whatever it is, 500 million users or 2 billion users or something, and I want to make more money. And that's when it happened that, iPhone 2007, things start really changing. By 2010, Android and iOS had pretty much sorted out the market between the two of them. And people are starting to see users prefer apps because they're simple. Picture of thing, click thing, even though you could do that 100 ways. But companies really, really preferred apps because you couldn't leave them for something else without their permission. So if you clicked on a link in an app somehow, the app had the ability to determine what happened to that click. Slightly different world with Android and Apple. Apple took it on themselves to tell apps more about what they could and couldn't do and how they did it. So Apple owned the click a bit more. Android less so, but it wasn't the user or the content provider. It was the app owner who decided where that click went, whether you opened it in a browser in your own app, which became quite standard. People didn't realize it, but it was opening in a browser in your own app, which meant that the person who ran the app found out everything you did on the internet from that point, even though you'd gone off their property. And they owned the logins and everything around that. So it was separate from your other internet behavior. And they'd kind of walled that off. So apps became an incredibly appealing idea for businesses just because, they gave them so much more complete control and visibility into user activity. And also at the same time, little company could make an app, but it was not that exciting. And it wasn't really much more than a wrapped web page, whereas a bigger company could build big, rich app experiences, which seemed more capable and more useful in the internet, even though you could probably have done it with a browser, but it wouldn't have seemed as slick, etc. And they didn't put the work into making those browser experiences as slick. So you then had people asking for the panopticizing app, please give it to me because it's better. And that was kind of I have that picture in my head of that kind of evolution, which wasn't planned from the start, but it was a bunch of steps of, the fact that people were building in bits of technology that users needed, let them build their group, their footprint, which gave them more power, which made them, be able to do more. And it built into a thing where what you ended up with is singular winners. And so you ended up with like all near monopolies across the board, social, search, etc. And you've got some weird outliers like Wikipedia, which achieve the same thing, but in a very small niche as a non-profit. But for the most part, you've got corporate-owned spaces in any kind of sphere. The operating system in the Office suite was Microsoft, which was dull, but they had that. Everything else was a new Silicon Valley hyperscaler, basically.
Yeah, and it's also kind of brings into question the decisions that were taken in for example, in Russia and in China. Google had to leave both of those jurisdictions because they didn't want to host their servers in the countries, right? That should have been a big wake-up call in regards to what Google's actual business model is, not just what they state, because they talk about research and all that stuff, but in reality, it's just harvesting data and advertising.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all got those things where you feel like in your life you were standing right there, but you still missed it. And like I was in Beijing working in tech in 2009 when Google left. I knew people who worked at Google who kind of were looking for a job or moving on or going back to the US or whatever. And looking at it then, I was still enough of a foreigner just arrived in China to look at it and think, oh, China don't know what they're missing out on here. Silly, they didn't understand, how important this was and what they were losing. Although this is what makes it even sillier. At the same time, when they sort of brought out Google Docs, etc., I was talking about how blocking them was kind of protectionist on the part of China because they realized they wanted to build a domestic version. And it wasn't until years later that it started fitting together for me. And I was like, actually, absolute credit to the authorities in China for the foresight. You don't have to like why they wanted to do what they did, but they saw, and maybe it's because if you are, in that space, you see what the other people in the space are doing. If you're a mobster, you understand mobsters. They understood very quickly this is a threat to Chinese sovereignty very fast. And it wasn't just a matter of, we don't want people to be able to look up stuff about, what happened on the 4th of June, 89. It was also about, that's tied to it, but that was about like controlling the narrative, which was about sovereignty for them. And so it wasn't just about freedom of speech and access to information. It was about what happens when you start having foreign companies have that much influence on your society. And then very quickly, if you look at it, that's why I said I was standing right there and I missed it, because It was only much later that I put together, oh, no Google Maps. They're not allowing foreign companies to map their entire country and have better data on movement than they do. They got Chinese companies to do it. It had to provide an API to the state in various ways. Same thing with, I had to implement, working in China, I had to implement Chinese data protection laws for Chinese customers. So I had to spin up servers inside China to hold the CRM system that we use for our Chinese customers, because we actually got audited that we weren't shipping Chinese user data overseas. They actually did that. That was actual regulation. And if you think about it from the Chinese user's perspective, do you want random foreign companies having all of your information and being able to buy and sell it? And there was actually a lot of foresight and heavy-handed but solid forward-thinking regulation that I'm sure in some ways Europe wished to hell they'd done now. I'm much less aware of the Russian situation, and I don't think it was as much of a thought-out response as in China. But I can certainly say that it's definitely, in no small part, straight up sovereignty stuff. The Russians knew what a large internet company can do and how important they can become to your economy and your information economy, certainly. And they did not want foreign groups to have that much control in Russia. And so they were doing that on not a purely, but there's certainly a sovereignty, aspect to that.
Yeah, and I think that what happened in Europe was that at that point the EU was still growing into this, all-encompassing octopus with tentacles in every country, right? So at that point in time, you still had some degree of sovereignty on the national level, and a lot of these smaller countries, for example, Sweden, even though it was very tech forward and very tech savvy, saw itself as a small player and understood that maybe it makes sense to give up some sort of sovereignty right now, but we also get to go on the American market. And I think for Sweden, it kind of worked out because, we got Spotify, we got Skype, you have Klarna now, you have all these companies that maybe would not have managed to have
Ericsson.
that sort of. Ericsson was there, right? Yeah. But
very early,
but you understand what I'm saying. So it kind of made sense to not, rock the boat too hard.
Yeah.
But for big entities like Russia and China, it was obvious, that you had to get these guys out.
Yeah. I think, and it's kind of interesting. It would have been obvious from their perspective, right? You've got a domestic industry you want to see grow, etc., and there's clearly enough of a market at home for that to be a super non-trivial, but also so big that you certainly don't want it to be foreign. You don't want that amount of your economy to be foreign. And if you look at things like payments in China, like the amount, it staggers me. I kind of get sleepless nights occasionally just thinking about how much is known about China by the major app providers, because they're the payment provider. And the state, is very, very openly and obviously the end recipient of all of that information when they need to be, or when they want to be. And the idea for a country the size of China that would be in foreign hands is actually absurd. If you think about it from that perspective, what governor of China could allow a foreign country to have that level of information about something the size of China?
Right, and then you end up with this. Obviously, it's a bit harder to get up to that level, but the Chinese people are obviously very smart, as we've seen from movies and TV shows throughout the years.
In my house, and they're very smart.
Yeah, exactly. And so they kind of figured it out, and they caught up, and some would argue that they have surpassed the West, and now you have, in some regards, and now you're in the situation where everybody's playing catch up in a way. Like America, not so much because they were there, but I think Australia is playing catch up, England is playing catch up, all of the EU is playing catch up. And how do you catch up? is it more a question of waiting for the next wave? I mean, do you start going, to PWAs, or how do you make heads and tails out of this stuff?
Well, I think it's very interesting because I would say the only entity that has a chance of catching up, and like you said, I think the way like what we're talking about as being kind of concerning things about the Silicon Valley model. You know, they've gone way past there in China on a bunch of facets, right? The Omni app. There are people who own devices that only connect to WeChat, and they do all their browsing, all of their social, everything through that. To the point that the state there then kind of pushed them around a bit and made there be other things like Xiaohongshu, etc., so that you have to have like Little Red Book. So you have and Douyin, they let TikTok exist so that you had different things people wanted to use. So they didn't just go and buy WeChat phones. Right? They were worried that that's too much because they want to keep the duopoly of like WeChat Pay and Alipay, etc. So going back to the rest of the world, I don't think anybody else has a chance of taking on entities the size of Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook. That's not a thing you do head on. And so you've got to look at like how else has that happened elsewhere, right? So the big example to me is Microsoft, who were at the time the most powerful, most well-resourced, wealthiest company in the world, calling Linux a virus and trying to do everything they could to kill it, and they never could. And it ended up taking over the phone for the most part, and the desktop and the data center, not the desktop. Yeah, but now more and more gaming machines are sold with Linux, etc. So I think that's the big clue, right? Is that the alternative method is openness. That's the way to win is not to beat them at that game, which they've got sewn up and was always rigged to start with, but to try and level out the game. You asked about PWAs and the web, right? The web is super important, and browsers are beyond important. It's like I want to throw rocks at Mozilla Foundation all the time because they're one of the most important organizations in the world, if you ask me. Custodians of the only non-Google owned Chrome-based browser out there that works well enough to do almost everything you want on the internet, effectively and without feeling like you're a second-class citizen. And yet they're squandering their position and their money because of mismanagement. But that's super important. PWAs, right? Progressive web apps. Now, what that is basically it's a website that if you've been on like whatever you're viewing this on is probably a website, right? It may be an app wrapped around a website, but that's basically what it is. We all use things like Zoom, and you realize, oh, well, that's both an app and a website. There's 100 things you're doing like that when you go up. If you run the Booking.com app, it's basically just the website. So PWAs are a way of, instead of wrapping that as an app, just letting websites exist on the phone. And the difference there, the really important difference is the PWA is delivered to you over the internet and goes on directly onto your phone. The app that wraps around Booking.com goes through the App Store and is mediated and controlled in a bunch of ways. And so I think PWAs are the app expression of the importance of having an open internet. The whole thing we're talking about here is having the ability to do what you want on the internet, to not be forced into someone's business model, to not have to ask permission, etc. And so browsers, PWAs on things like phones are really, really, really important part of that. And I think they're important because they're open. And that openness, I think, is the real way to push back and to fight back against these big monopolies, etc. The only realistic way of taking them on.
Yeah, and speaking of inserting yourself in between the customer and the app, I think there's a lot of websites, a lot of apps, a lot of business models that are predicated on that fact. You have stuff like, let's say, Instagram is trying to get itself in between you and your friends, and they want you to use their app to communicate, right?
Mm-hmm.
For them, it's great when you have the pandemic because that means more users. Same with Zoom and Tinder is a mediator of meeting new people, right? And we have to understand that these things are literally, their business models are predicated around you having a problem. That problem may or may not have been created by the same people, right? Because they kind of pull you apart from your friends through these algorithmic feeds and so on. So it is a it is a model of extraction, and whether they extract data, time, attention, that's what they do. It's not a business model where they enable you to do more. It's not a business model where they empower you.
Yeah, well, I think the way I kind of understand that myself is it's from that problem solution model we were talking about before, right? So the internet, you had this way of connecting computers, but it was lacking a bunch of different features that people needed, like a way to maintain their identity and keep their stuff there. So you then have things like search, which finds things for you, and you have things like social, which connects you to your friends. So they're supporting a need. But the business then is, can do that until essentially everyone who's going to join has joined. It's complete. And they still have the drive to become more profitable. They're still responding to shareholders and worse investors, like VCs, who then demanding return on what they put in. And so they're looking at that, saying, "Well, how do we now return bigger profits off of this?" And one of the best ways to do that is to swap out the problem you came to solve. Right. And you look at a bunch of these products, and that's exactly what they've done. So the most obvious one to me is something like Facebook and most of the social apps, which started off, you've got a problem, calling it a problem or a need, desire to connect with your friends. You can't do that. Here's a more convenient, a simpler way to connect to your friends. So originally, it's all person-to-person connections. Everything you're looking at on that site originally was stuff produced by your friends. Right, and social was called social because you socialized on it. If you look at the majority of social platforms now, they've swapped out that desire to connect with friends and family for your desire to solve the problem of your dopamine levels dipping. Right, because they've realized it's quite calculated and clever if you're in their shoes and you need to satisfy the investors, that is a more reliable way of getting you to use their application. And so they swap out one need for the other, right? And that's classic mode of intuitification, but that's why they do it, right? It's because they started off fulfilling a need. They do that. They now have captive users. The only way to get more money out of them is to find another need or to swap it out for a more compelling need. And that's exactly what happens over time. So, yeah, I think it's really crucial to understand that because it's an organic flow. If you look at it as someone who just sees a market as something that grows like an ecosystem, it's the correct and proper way for it to proceed, right? It's like this is progress. And it doesn't involve necessarily a nasty and shittifier somewhere hiding behind the couch, leaping out at you and saying, "Ha, I've swapped your Facebook for a bad thing." It's an organic process you can expect to happen because of the economics and the structure of what happened, and the base technology, how it was put together.
Exactly, and like you said, you touched upon it, but it's you have to understand when you speak about the economics of it, you have to also understand that the whole system is based on credit and valuations. So if I come into Facebook, right, I get stock options at a certain price, right? If the stock dips, I'm losing money.
Yeah.
So there's literally zero incentive to say like, hey, you know what, we're big enough. Let's just service our customers and become Coca-Cola, turn on like a steady profit, Coca-Cola, Gillette, all these things. No, we want to grow because that's where the money is, and everybody's trying to make money. There is no moral imperative. There is no guardrail anywhere, right?
I mean, that's a really good point. I'm like throwing blame at the feet of VCs, but it's also the way that they then realized the best way to structure these companies was to align the economic incentives of the employees with those VCs and put them in a position where they're sitting, if they're thinking, should I swap out the feed for family posts with something I know will get you addicted? Well, like, which one earns me more money, right? They're not sitting
It's
there as
not
moral
addictive.
arbiters.
It's not addictive. It's habit forming. Learn that from the tobacco industry. It's not
Right.
addictive. It's just habit forming.
Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
in
All right.
their case,
Yeah.
it's
So,
profit inducing. So
which is the most important aspect. We all know
yeah,
that. It's why
yeah.
we get up in the morning, right? No, but jokes aside, like hopefully we have 15 minutes to tackle this question. I think this is like the most important question. And even though we try to keep this very light, here comes the 100 million Sato question. And it's a bit like this, right? Because we're talking about business, because business is the engine that on which our society runs, right? So you have this typical business cycle, 7 to 10 years, fixed capital investment, very, very dependent on credit expansion. Then you have the Kuznets cycle, which is 50 to 25 years. It's based on demographics and infrastructure. And then you have the Kondratiev wave, the K wave, 45 to 60 years, which is defined by fundamental technological revolution, steam engine, electricity, internet, and now AI. Now, considering that the normal business cycle is ending due to unforeseen amounts of credit in the system, right? Everybody's talking about the debts and so on. And a new Kuznets cycle, the infrastructure and demographical cycle, hasn't even really started in most of the Western world because the demographics are going down, which is why you get to talk about migration and so on, right? And then observing that the latest K wave might not even have people at its core because it's AI driven. Could this, and this is a big question, right? Could this lead to a societal splintering, but at the same time, a splintering of the networks? The empire long united must divide. Are we on the verge of seeing like the internet, because it's already like partly private, right? You have Facebook, it's its own network, Apple, Amazon, Google, they're different networks, right? Could you end up in a situation where some people live their life on Google or an Apple world, and then you could have like people, the Rebel Alliance, living their life on islands of Linux and maybe Sato network and stuff like that. Is that science fiction or?
No, because I think we see it largely. There's a heavy bulk of Chinese users who don't connect to anything Western whatsoever. So aside from a few things like DNS queries, which might, like locating other machines, which might cross borders just because they're open protocols. I think people already do. There's a lot of people who, it was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. It was the first place I heard someone use Google as a verb, right? So that's ancient history now. I mean, it places me in the dark ages, but that was before Josh Whedon was even cancelled. So, that's been a long time, right? That's been how people see things, and I think I tell people I use a paid for search engine because it's just significantly better, and the $5 a month just seems a far better deal, and they're really surprised. People don't even realize that's a thing and that's possible. Now that's because some people just don't even know the difference between the address bar and the search and whatever, and that's been nicely covered up for them, and they don't really care. So I think it's more than possible. I think we're there. I think there's a lot of people who live essentially app-driven lives, and they sometimes wander off the app because, at least in the West, like in China, if you are on a platform and there's an ad and you want to go and see their ad, you invariably end up on the provider's space inside that app. So if you're on WeChat and you click a link to like, oh, I do want to eat cheesecake, you end up at the Cheesecake Shop's WeChat mini app at best. Little Red Book, same thing. You end up on the pages for the provider, and and the reason for that is that the advertisers are also customers there, right? And the companies love that. So you have to set up your space on there infrastructure and exist only there. You can't have an independent company website. So that's the template. And I think we're seeing that more and more in the West, where you only kind of maybe venture out off the Instagram feed because you clicked on, I want to buy these shoes, and you end up on a Google-based website for the shoe company. And yeah, I think that's quite possible. I actually really love the idea of splintering. Right, I'm a guy who'd rather wander the back alleys of some new city I've never been to, finding record stores and cafes that locals go to, than go to a big shiny mall or a reworked seafront. That's the showpiece of this city. I think that there's a lot more interest and basically cool shit to get out there if you let people just do their thing. It's not going to be as polished. It's not going to be as available to as many people, and we're not all going to have the same experience because it doesn't work that way. But I think that's a really great future to hope for. The question is whether those things are interoperable or not, right? So if we're all splintered onto the app provider that we have, if you could only go to the internet that your ISP connects you to, that's not a great future. So I really love the idea of having a really varied experience and having local experiences, literally local on the network. If you see the network as a graph of nodes connected, that you spend your time around the stuff that you bumped into. Now, that might be geographically dispersed, but it might be mediated by the people you've met, etc. You might travel from one place to another in that network and actually spend some time somewhere else. I think that's actually a much nicer vision of the internet than we're all doing the same thing in the same few places, having the same experiences. But the issue is, like, how do we get there? The EU wants to try and regulate some of that. The freedom loving, the Linux heads just hope, I think, for the most part, that will happen. And I think it's a combination of things like regulation and so forth are important to stop monopolies and so forth at the commercial social level. That's good for society to have some kind of control of monopolies. But side of point coming in, we need to have infrastructure that can be agnostic from the providers, so you don't have that thing where only the hyperscalers survive. So you need $1 trillion in VC to build the data centers to serve the users, and then no one else can compete. So we need infrastructure that can support new and interesting things of any size as they grow and equal-handedly. And we need, at the same time as that, we need open protocols and peer-to-peer networks where we can have, we can break through some of the perils and the problems with, network effects, etc., where it's not a matter of you can only go to one place because they're the only place that has the stuff, right? We need to have some real thought going into how we build stuff, and that mostly is about being able to build applications on top of open protocols, so that data doesn't get stuck with the provider that first made that data popular, and that everyone has to continually compete to be the portal into the general open public data. And that to me is fundamental to how we push back against this stuff. Otherwise, what we end up with is, we end up on separate networks, but they're literally just the China network, the Google network, etc. And we're kind of stuck where we are.
Yeah, and I think that reading between the lines, what you're saying there is that the promise of the internet, it's kind of going away in this new model, because you end up, it was supposed to unite people, make it easier to communicate, and then you end up with all these different networks that don't want you to leave them. And like if you add a link to Twitter to a post, they will derank your post. Right, that's why you see a lot of people writing like a thread and putting the link in the second or the third post because they don't want to lose rank.
Yeah, and then inversely, you post to Twitter a link to Twitter in a lot of things, and Twitter, it won't show properly. Like it won't like do the open graph thing where you get a picture in the preview and stuff. Like people block each other's content, and I think that's just a tendency. That's the way it will go. It'll splinter into those silos. and we kind of need to push back against that. I think there was always the hope of the internet and the actual internet, right? And the hope of the internet was like a picture of what could happen if it all went right. But actually, the internet didn't even have the capacity to really do that when people started having that hope. People saw computers connected together and they saw the possibility, but that wasn't ever actually necessarily there for two reasons. One, it was immature technology, but the other one was it hadn't been built for that purpose. And so it was lacking these pieces, right? It was lacking certain things, which meant inevitably, due to business models and due to technical constraints, it was going to get, it was going to get enclosed is the word I'm looking for, and owned by bigger players. And so the question is, we've got this sliver of that original trajectory still available to us through browsers and the fact that the internet still is interoperable and connectable for the most part across spaces, etc. What do we do with it? Right. And obviously our hope at Cyto is that we use it properly to interconnect people with open protocols, and we start building things that push back against that tendency by providing those fundamental things that we're missing in the first place.
Exactly. And one great thing about the internet, unlike our planet where, the English could travel across an ocean and start a new country, and then, the problems of the world followed them eventually and saw to it that they could not be any different from anywhere else.
I think a lot of people see the English as the problem of the world in that context, but anyway.
I didn't want to say it, but I agree with your assessment. They kind of are. What great thing about the internet is that it has an infinite blue ocean, right? And the beautiful thing about the thing that I see happening in Sato is that it kind of looks at that early promise of the internet and says, hey guys, what about this thing? How about we go back to what we said when we started this journey? And I think that's a very positive message.
Yeah, I think it's the good old anamnesis. We've talked about this for a long time at Cyto, that sense or that experience of remembering something you knew before, right? Like, and it feels like learning. We use these terms like internet with its inter in it, right? Like, oh, it's always there. But actually we've kind of often, I think, forgotten why it seems so cool, right? Because it's the version that's delivered to us isn't that thing anymore. And so it's time maybe in part to kind of remember how cool it felt just to connect in the first place, once upon a time, just to be able to discover things, and think about what was really amazing about those experiences and how do we make that possible on an ongoing basis rather than only discovering things that were made for you to discover and only connecting to things that were put in front of you to connect to, which is more and more the way it's going, and actually be able to have that kind of sense of excitement and anticipation about we don't know what's out there on that thing, and that being a really great positive thing.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I think
I was about to say, I was just checking, am I going crazy or is that my settings? But
No, that was me.
The internet's
I was going to say that.
Let's get a new one.
Yeah. Oh, no, I was going to say that the core takeaway is that you don't really want anyone in between what you want to find and what actually exists, right? Like, don't let your discovery process be mediated by someone else. And that's kind of like what's happening both with Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. This feed that is algorithmic, that is based on some sort of dopamine hit to keep you watching ads, right? Let's move away from that and regain our sense of wonder. Let's see what's out there.
Yeah, the whole battle against the idea of content, right? Stuff that was produced to be put out there in front of people rather than stuff that was made to be itself, right? That's really exciting if you can imagine, a world full of just new and exciting things rather than presupposed stuff that's intermediated and presented to you for someone's profit.
Well, there we go. We have our first episode about what happened to the internet. I think we covered a lot of ground.
We did.
Hopefully, we'll have more things to talk about next week. But we could have a very special episode next week. We have something cooking. We won't announce it just yet, but Yeah, thank you so much, Richard, and thank you everyone who's been tuning in. Otherwise, you can always catch us on Apple, Spotify, and RSS feed. It's called Open Internet Pod. Do subscribe, do like, do share with friends, and we'll catch you guys next week.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks, everyone.